Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our November 18th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features expert tips for managing your 2024 farm income taxes, as well as a discussion about the impacts of European Union climate policies and how you can observe those impacts firsthand as part of an Iowa Farm Bureau market study tour visiting Brussels and the Netherlands next year. Let's start with farm income taxes and Christine Tidgren, who's the director of the Center for Agricultural Law and Taxation at Iowa State University. Spokesman reporter Corey Munson has the story.
We're here today with Christine Tidgren, director of the Iowa State Center for Agricultural Law and Taxation. So before we dig into specific tax situations, can you kind of share with us any considerations that are unique to farmers that they should be aware of for taxation? Just kind of a primer on the issue of farm taxation.
Well, farmers are not known for liking to keep good records. They're known for doing amazing things in the field and growing our food, but that's a burden to some of us. And so I would just want to encourage farmers, you have this time post-harvest to get your records all in order. Your accountant or your tax professional that you work with, if you work with one, and some of you I realize are pretty much tax professionals in your own right, so you've got it all and you do this already. But I think this question, we're really addressing those that maybe work with a tax professional and don't really like the idea of having to gather records. You know, the most important things are making sure that your professional knows if you bought any new equipment, if you traded any equipment, if you sold anything. Make sure that you have all of your inputs, the cost of those, everything organized well, so that when you go in for your planning, they will have the information that they need to sort of help you. Also, if you sold grain using any sort of contracts, have a copy of those contracts so they understand what the options are, those types of things. So record keeping, always very important. We like to harp on it. Again, not always a favorite, but it doesn't have to be beautiful. Do the best you can. Just make sure you gather all the records, because if you leave something off, that can be a problem.
Here in a little bit, we're going to talk about some new ownership rules, but ahead of that, are there any specific changes to state or federal tax law that might impact farmers? I'm thinking specifically, I think there's some new capital gains exclusions maybe coming into effect.
On the Iowa side, we have had for the last couple of years some capital gain exclusion for retired farmers. The retired farmer rule has been something that we started implementing last year, and it involves if you are a farmer who has farmed for 10 years or more and owned your land for 10 years or more, you have a choice. You can choose, if you rent your ground out as cash rent, you can choose to exclude that from Iowa income tax. Now, this is not federal tax. You'll still pay your federal income tax, but Iowa has passed a special law that says retired farmers can exclude their rental income from Iowa income tax if they make an election. Now, when you make that election, you do need to understand that you are foregoing the option later down the road if you decide to sell that land to exclude the Iowa capital gain from tax. So there's a trade-off, but that law does provide a couple of good options for retired farmers. And right now, under Iowa law, if you are a farmer who has owned your land for 10 years and you've farmed for 10 years, you still can exclude the capital gain from your land, even if you're not retired, for farmland only. And so that's a law that's available to everybody. If you sell to a relative, and it's third degree, so it's not extended relatives, but fairly close relatives, you can also exclude your capital gain, even if you do not meet those requirements that you had to be a farmer for 10 years. And then we also have had reinstated retroactively the breeding and dairy capital gain livestock exclusion. What happened with the new tax law that went into effect at the beginning of 2023 is the legislature had originally repealed the ability of a dairy farmer, a farmer that has breeding stock. When they sold that, they've always historically been able to exclude the gain from the sale of that livestock. If you have a dairy cow, you're not out selling dairy cows, you're making milk. But once in a while, you need to sell a dairy cow. And that, under the tax law, is just like selling another asset that you have in your business. It's subject to tax on the gain. And Iowa has always excluded that gain, well, for a very long time. But that kind of went by the wayside with the new tax law. But then the legislature took a second look and they said, oh, wait a minute, we need to reenact that capital gain exclusion for farmers who raise dairy, breeding, draft. And so they did. And that was reinstated retroactively back to 2023. So those folks are eligible to exclude that gain again. If they didn't realize that, they can go backwards and file amended returns.
Are there any strategies or actions farmers should consider before the end of this calendar year to help them reduce their tax burden?
So we always have this question and we always have to think about what our situation is. And this year is an interesting one because some of our farmers are experiencing lower income than they perhaps have had in recent years. And so some of the strategies that we just almost do every year as a matter of course, they may not be the best strategy this year. So you really have to have a fairly good handle on what your income is going to look like to determine whether or not it's a good idea to buy that piece of equipment at the end of this year or wait until the beginning of next year. Whether you want to prepay for your farm supplies at the end of this year or whether it's better to purchase them next year. So farmers, we're usually all about defer income. But if you're having a low income year and you expect to have more income next year, or if you expect your tax rates to go up, then you don't want to defer. You actually want to accelerate income. So we've had some of our people who, because they've had lower income, we've advised things like when you put fertilizer on this year, you usually take a present deduction under Section 180. Maybe that's not the best thing to do this year because maybe you want to spread that deduction out over years, which you can also do by making a different election. And so you can amortize that cost. So things like that are options that your tax professional can help you figure out, but you have to figure it out based on what your income situation is for the year. Another thing that we really love is if you're selling grain this year, you can do deferred payment contracts with the grain buyer and just make sure you're following the rules, that it's a valid deferred payment contract. And instead of just doing one contract, you can do 5 contracts, multiple contracts. And then what happens with deferred payment contracts is the deferred payment contract says, I will not receive payment until next year. So I sell in 24, I won't receive payment until 25. However, the tax law has a provision that they call that an installment agreement. And the tax code has a provision that when I'm actually filing my return and I realize, oh, it would be nice for me to have a little more income in 24 and not push everything to 25, what I can do is elect out of the installment method. So if I have 5 contracts, I can choose to elect out maybe for 3 of them, and the other 2 I push forward to 25. It's a great tool to be able to sort of find that sweet spot with where you'd like your income to be in a particular year.
And that's something that co-ops and grain buyers are used to working with, that process?
Yes, they are. That's a very common process. Another thing that co-ops and grain processors are used to doing is helping farmers who want to give gifts of grain. It's another good thing to think about year end. you're allowed to transfer the title of your grain over to your church or to the Red Cross. And then the charitable organization sells it. And what happens is you just, for that particular amount of grain, you still got to take all of your deductions for growing it. You don't have to go back and recapture those, but you didn't have to pay any tax on it. So it's just a transfer of your income to the charitable organization, and it's tax-free to you, and it really benefits the charity.
I'm tempted to say the answer to this question is all of it, but what documents specifically should farmers have lined up when they talk to their tax professional?
Well, as we kind of said, you need to have whatever record keeping you do on an annual basis that has all of your inputs, all of your expenses, all of your sales, all of your activities, all of your purchases. Your tax professional, if you've been working with them for a while, they have your depreciation schedules for your depreciable equipment, but anything new that you purchased, anything that you sold, they need to have records of all of that. So yes, I think the answer is sort of all of it. You do need to have records that reflect any tax impacting transaction that occurs in your farm operation. And unfortunately, that's most of your transactions.
So shifting topics a little bit here, I understand there's a new law coming into effect that requires some farm entities and other small businesses to report their ownership information to the Treasury Department prior to January 1st. Can you fill us in on these new requirements and who needs to file a report specifically?
So I'd say the biggest consideration this year are for any farmers out there who have an LLC, a corporation, an S corporation, a limited partnership, or a limited liability partnership. And I say all those because there's a new federal law that requires any of those entities, you had to have been an entity that filed a document with the Secretary of State's office in order to come into existence. But there's a new federal law that requires those entities to go to a federal website and report their beneficial owners. And I'm giving an urgent call because a lot of people, not just farmers, but a lot of folks are not getting this message and they don't realize that this is a requirement. And if you do not go online and file your beneficial owner information by January 1st of 2025, you'll get penalized or you could be subject to penalties. And the penalties are $591 per day of violation. So this is a law that has a lot of teeth. It's a law that a lot of people still haven't heard about. We talk about it in our tax schools and in our tax sessions because even though it's not a tax law specifically, it is a law that's administered by a branch of the Treasury Department called FinCEN. And the law was passed all the way back in 2021, and it was passed to make sure that the federal government who knew who owned certain entities, because these entities can be used for all sorts of crimes. And when you register with the state doesn't know who the owners of your LLC are, for example. And so it's an interesting law. It's kind of the biggest topic that we have this year that is interestingly not tax specific, but it's tax adjacent. And we're just trying to spread the word however we can.
What are the due dates associated with filing that information?
If you were an entity that was in existence before January 1st of 2024, you have up until the end of this year to file. If you formed a new entity this year, so you created a new LLC or corporation, you only have 90 days from the date that you file in order to get that report filed. So if you haven't filed it, you're 3 months out, just go ahead and file it. You just need to file. And then next year, in 2025, if you create a new entity, you will only have 30 days to file your first report. Now, Congress could step in and change something at some point, but right now we have no relief from this rule. It has gone into effect and we do need to file.
And where can farmers go to find more information on this process and find out where to file, all that good stuff?
Right. So they can come to our website, the CALT website, calt.iastate.edu. And on that homepage, there is a link that says beneficial ownership information reporting. If they want to click there, I have all of the links that they can find out more information on our article there that explains this more. If they would rather go directly to the agency, which is fine, there's a lot of great guidance, and this is where you'd go to file. It is fincen.gov, FINCEN. That is the agency responsible for administering this new law.
Looking ahead to 2025, I understand there are some provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 that are set to expire next year. What portions of that law that impact farmers specifically may be going away, and is there any talk of extending these?
So, yes, we have all said that 2025 will likely be the Super Bowl of tax, and that's because most of the provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are scheduled to expire on December 31st of next year. And the election a couple of weeks ago has, whichever group is in charge, sort of their policies are the ones that will most likely move forward. So after seeing who it looks like will be in control of Congress and the presidency, it's probably more likely that many of these provisions they will attempt to extend then, but there's no guarantee that they will. And so we just have to watch and see what unfolds. But the provisions in particular, there's a lot of them, but I'll just highlight the most important ones, is that tax rates as a whole are scheduled to go up. So if you were having $700 and some $1,000 of income as a married couple this year, you would be in the top tax rate of 37%. In 2026, if you had $525,000 or something close to that as a married couple, you'd be in the top tax bracket of 39.6. And then just sort of shift all of those accordingly for income under that. There's a few places where if you're currently in the 24% bracket, you'll jump up to the 33% bracket. So that is significant, just increased tax rates. Another thing, though, that's very significant in the farming sector is a deduction that we've had for businesses that are pass-throughs or sole proprietorships. It's called the 199A deduction. It's been a 20% deduction, which means that if you had $100,000 of income, you would have your income reduced to $80,000 for tax purposes. So you save quite a bit of tax. That's been a great help to a lot of agricultural producers. That is scheduled to go away. Tied to that, before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we always had a provision called DPAD, which was used very often with agricultural cooperatives, and they were entitled to a deduction for their grain that they used, and they could pass that deduction through to their members. Most of your listeners know the DPAD. And then the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it got rid of DPAD, but it created a provision under this 199A that was essentially just like it. So it restored DPAD, really, 199AG. Well, that provision, too, would go away if it's allowed to expire as it's scheduled to expire. Now, with respect to estate and gift tax, we have another situation where the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the amount of property that you could have at your death or that you had given away during your lifetime and be subject to estate tax. So back in 2018, they said, okay, we used to have a $5 million exemption, and now we're going to make it a $10 million exemption. Well, over time, that has been adjusted for inflation. So in 2025, we actually have a $13.92 million exemption. I think it's 2. So if I died in 2025, if I had $13.5 million, I would owe no estate tax at my death. If we get to the end of 2025 and Congress has not extended that doubling, in 2026, we'll be looking at a $7 million exemption. So that would make a difference because there are farms that have higher land values now, and many more would be brought in to have to think about that. So that's a big provision that Congress will look at and address as well, is that estate tax exemption. Oh, and I will say, why it matters is if you owe even $1 of estate tax, you're taxed at a 40% rate. So the estate tax is really high.
What is the best option to get information about this? I know your website has a lot of information, but you should also be sure to have a tax professional you can refer back to, right?
That's absolutely right. We really recommend that farms partner with a tax professional who is expert in farming. You can be a great tax professional, but if you do not understand farming, you're probably not going to be the best resource for a farmer. So there are plenty of great tax professionals out there who work with farmers all over the state. And so if you do not have a tax professional, my suggestion would be to talk to your friends and find out who they use, talk to people you know.
And then real quickly, before we go, just remind us of your website.
So our website is www.calt.iastate.edu.
Farm income taxes can be complicated, but we appreciate Christine sharing a roadmap to help farmers approach their taxes strategically this year. To learn more about that, we highly recommend you check out Iowa Farm Bureau's in-depth webinar on farm income taxes. That live webinar is today, November 18th at 1 p.m., and a recording will be available for viewing afterwards. To find that farm income tax webinar, click the link in the notes for this podcast episode. While you're down in the notes for this episode, you'll also want to read more on the other topic Corey and Christine discussed, the U.S. Treasury Department's requirement that farmers file beneficial ownership information with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network by no later than January 1st, 2025. Farmers who fail to do that could face steep fines and other penalties, so please take time to learn about what's required and get it done now. Again, you can learn more about that topic by heading out to calt.iastate.edu or by using one of the helpful links we've provided in the podcast notes. Okay, let's quickly turn our attention from taxes and regulatory requirements here in the U.S. and spend some time exploring the regulatory environment abroad. Specifically, let's talk about European Union climate policies that impact agriculture, such as the European Green Deal. For years now, U.S. farmers have read about the scope and impact of EU regulations. So next summer, we're going to send a group of Iowa farmers overseas to explore that impact firsthand. For more on that, here's Corey Munson with Iowa Farm Bureau economist Dr. Christopher Pudenz.
Farm Bureau is hosting a market study tour to the Netherlands and Belgium next spring. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip? When is it taking place and kind of what's its purpose?
The 2025 Market Study Tour will take place next summer, June 7th through 15th. We'll be going to Brussels, which is in Belgium, and then from there we'll be going to the Netherlands and spending the rest of the week. The purpose of this trip is to learn as much as we possibly can about European Union climate policies and the political reaction to those climate policies over the past 5 years or so. And then to bring the knowledge that we learn over there back stateside to inform our families, friends, communities, and the like.
Can you tell us specifically about maybe some of the stops or what's planned on this trip, as well as what issues you can expect to learn about? I know you mentioned the climate policy being kind of first and foremost there.
Yeah, so the two countries we're hitting are Belgium, Brussels specifically, and then the Netherlands. Starting out in Brussels, I would say that our goals there are twofold. First, we're going to spend some time in the European Quarter. The European Quarter is the part of Brussels where a lot of the European Union bureaucratic institutions are housed. So we're going to travel there to just kind of experience the monstrosity that is the European Union bureaucratic machine. We're also going to work to line up some meetings with the ag policy groups and the other professionals who work in Brussels on behalf of farmers. So, meet with peer organizations similar to Iowa Farm Bureau or American Farm Bureau while we're in Brussels, if we can, to try and see what we can learn about EU climate policy, such as the European Green Deal and the EU deforestation regulation. That second one in particular, the EU deforestation regulation, that has direct impacts for farmers in Iowa because it covers a number of commodities, including beef from cattle and then soybeans. From Brussels, we'll travel to the Netherlands, and that's where we'll spend most of our time during the trip. We're going to meet with various ag groups, such as USDA Foreign Ag Service or FAS. We're going to try and meet with folks like the Dutch Ministry of Ag, discuss EU policy with other stakeholder groups. In particular, we're going to try and meet with some livestock groups because of the treatment that methane typically gets by these regulations. While we're in the Netherlands, we're also going to go to the world's largest flower auction. I've heard it's just very overwhelming. There's so many smells, there's so many sights, so many colors. Everything looks perfect. The Netherlands is famous for their flowers. Anyone in Iowa who knows about tulip time in Pella is familiar with that. And they're also known for their horticulture and their growing of vegetables in greenhouses. And then finally, we're going to learn about Dutch innovation. They're a very innovative country, what they've done with greenhouses, like I mentioned. They've also been very innovative as it relates to water level management and sea level management. A good chunk of the country has literally been reclaimed from the sea. They've been at war with water levels for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so that should be a fascinating discussion. Finally, we're going to do some fun things too. There's a lot of work that gets done on these trips, a lot of learning that gets done on these trips, but participants will have the option to take some free time on their own, and we're going to offer the opportunity to tour the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam on the last day of the trip. But we're going to see a lot, we're going to learn a lot, and we'll have quite a bit of fun too.
So from your perspective as you're organizing this, what segment of our membership do you think this market study tour will appeal to, and what are the criteria to participate?
I would say that this trip is going to apply to a broad swath of the Iowa Farm Bureau membership. I'm going to start with dairy. The Netherlands has one of the EU's largest dairy herds, and they're famous for their dairy technology, such as milking robots and things like that. So dairy producers, you're going to love this trip. I would say that livestock producers more broadly would also be interested in this trip. The Netherlands is known for its swine herd. There's some famous swine genetics companies that are headquartered in the Netherlands, and because of those methane regulations as well. Cattle and soybean producers definitely will get value out of this trip. And like I've said, the Netherlands is famous for its production of flowers and vegetables, especially in greenhouses on the vegetable side. So folks interested in horticulture will definitely find value in this trip.
Can you tell us a little bit about the application process? Because I understand you have to apply for this. You don't just show up and day of and hop on a plane. What's that application and what's the cost associated with the trip?
Like you mentioned, an application is required. We really worked to streamline the application this year based on feedback that we'd gotten from previous years, so it's not particularly cumbersome. You fill out the application, make sure to get that in before January 3rd, and then selections will be notified in January, whether or not they've been selected for the trip or not. The cost for a single participant is $2,500, which for a week or more in Europe is an absolute steal. Any more, it costs almost that much to fly to Europe if you're getting decent flights. So I would say that single participant cost of $2,500, if you're interested in this at all, that's an absolute steal.
And I think in the past, spouses have also been invited to apply to attend the trip. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Corey. When we went to the UK, there were 4 or 5 different spouse couples that tagged along. Had a great time on the trip. Spouses are absolutely invited to apply. The cost for spouses is the full cost of the trip, which is $5,800.
Then finally, where can folks go to find out more information?
If folks want to learn more about the tour, they can go to iowafarmbureau.com/tour. Nice, simple URL, plug that in, it'll take them to the website. On the website, there's more information about the motivation for the trip, about deadlines, costs, requirements, things like that. There is an agenda that's listed out day by day where folks can go there and they can learn a little bit more about what we're doing in Brussels, what we're doing in the Netherlands, learn a little bit more about the flights. I really do think that this is going to be a fantastic trip. This will be the third trip that I've led in this role at Iowa Farm Bureau. And we're really trying to take some of these lessons that we've learned from the previous two and apply them to this one to really make the experience as positive as possible, as educational as possible, and as fun as possible for the folks who are selected.
You can't beat a chance to travel abroad and learn about ag alongside other farmers. If that market study tour of Brussels and the Netherlands appeals to you, click the link down in the notes for this episode or head out to iowafarmbureau.com to learn more. Of course, that market study tour is just one of many learning and networking opportunities Iowa Farm Bureau offers members and ag professionals throughout the year. And most of those opportunities aren't far from home, including Iowa Farm Bureau's upcoming annual meeting and county leadership conference, which is December 10th and 11th in Des Moines. You can check out our annual meeting agenda and register to join us using the link down in the podcast notes. And stay tuned for other learning and networking opportunities in the weeks ahead, including Iowa Farm Bureau's popular Young Farmer Conference, which draws more than 500 young farmers and ag professionals each year. Registration for that Young Farmer Conference opens in early December, and we'll include more information on that in the next podcast episode. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it helpful and that you'll join us for our next episode on December 2nd, which will be our first installment in a 3-part series about 3 young Iowa farmers who are being recognized for their outstanding leadership. You don't want to miss that. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.